So today I wanted to welcome you along to our how net zero can help businesses achieve growth. And I have been chatting to Adam about this event maybe about 6 months ago, and we were talking about ways that we could maybe help businesses as they begin to think about their strategies to achieve net zero. And a huge thank you to Adam for his patience with us while we've been looking at how we addressed that topic as well.
So good time with a COP. It's good.
Yes, I know, and just in 6 days, of course, the city is going to welcome the entire world, more or less, to Glasgow and showcase what a fantastic city we are, because we are already leading the way on sustainability in so many ways as well. But what I'm going to do is we've got 3 speakers today. We've got Adam, based off of Small 99. Many of you might already be familiar with Adam because he's been out on the circuit, really promoting the net zero message for small businesses. And Adam, will pass over to you in a minute. Then we're going to hear from Joe Mitchell from the Scottish Government, and Joe is going to help us understand a wee bit about procurement and maybe some of the issues around about sustainability and procurement for businesses as they go forward, and the sort of the requirement for helping the whole of Scotland to achieve net zero from a business perspective. And then we're going to have a wee chat just with Pauline, who's going to tell you a wee bit about the Supplier Development Fund here in Supplier Development Programme here in Glasgow, and some of the procurement opportunities around there, and where you can get some further information. So I'm getting a bit tongue twisted here, so I'm going to pass you straight over to Adam. So Adam, over to you.
I don't promise any funds that are opening to anybody here today, right? Let's see if I can share my screen. Let's go to that one, and then present. If people could just nod if that is saying the right thing on the big blue screen. Brilliant. So thank you very much for having me here. And yeah, good to get stuck into this. And I think net zero and business growth are two of the things that don't get spoken about enough, really. And it's been a real passion of mine to try and highlight that. I think the very nature of net zero as a term isn't ideal, because it feels like something you're losing or something very neutral, where in fact there is a growth provided by it. So go run through some of the opportunities today. Just very quickly on who Small 99 are. So I hope you know some familiar faces or familiar names in the chat, so it's good to see everyone here. But Small 99 really comes from this idea that 99% of the UK economy is a small business. So 99% of businesses in the UK have less than 49 employees, and 96% have less than 9 employees. So that's around 6 million businesses in the UK, which are a small micro business who need support in this transition to net zero, and need to be able to really drive a lot of that energy in the system to achieve it. Our goal is to get 1 million businesses to net zero by 2025. So there's the benefit of small businesses that they can move very quickly. They do have a lot of ambition and scale and can have a real impact here. And so we want to really try and harness that and drive that in a very positive way. There's a question here around how do we mobilize the masses? So in getting everyone to net zero, how do we do that? And I think the net zero term really is one that is slightly frustrating, as I mentioned before, because people are motivated by fear. People don't really care about the polar bears. They care about themselves and their business and actually being able to pay the bills. So how do we reduce the overwhelm around net zero? How do we break it down into a series of steps? And how do we sell that vision of a better future and bring some hope into it, which I'm hoping to do today? This is going to be the biggest industrial revolution ever. So a rather depressing stat is that we are now closer to 2050 than we are to 1990, which is always terrifying when I read it and realize it. But most industrial nations do have 2050 targets. There's a couple of exceptions, which are 2060, Saudi Arabia being in the news this week for being one of them. But 2050 isn't that far away. This is going to be a very large and a very fast revolution to deliver net zero in this time frame. So it's going to be bigger than the digital, industrial, or consumer revolutions that we saw from an economic shift point of view. And the biggest advantage we have right now is it's planned. We've got so many reports coming out from the Climate Change Committee, from councils, from government bodies on what is needed to deliver this change, and therefore we've got a roadmap for it. And where there's a roadmap, normally businesses can get involved. They can then plan accordingly where they see themselves fitting into that, and therefore where they can thrive as a result. So how do we profit from that plan shift, and how do you actually achieve that planning? Before we get stuck into that, I just want to really very quickly highlight and summarize what net zero is and just give a bit of a crash course in net zero. So net zero is broken down to 3 different scopes. You've got your created emissions, your consumed emissions, and then essentially everything else. In scope 3 is where, for most small businesses, your 90% or so of your emissions are going to sit. And that's going to include both your upstream, such as your purchasable supply chain stuff, as well as your downstream, such as disposal of any assets and of any products and services. And also it includes everything else within that, such as website hosting, digital emissions, how your staff get to work, how you get to work, the paper you're using, the printer you're printing it on. It really is everything else. So scope 3 will encompass most of your business activity. Scope 1 and 2, scope 1 tends to be vehicles, so any fleet that you're running and any emissions from them. Scope 2 is going to be your electricity generation. This isn't 100% accurate, this is very rough, so if you do go and get a big report from it, there's going to be more detail to it than this, but just as a very rough guide, that's a helpful way of thinking about it. That scope 3 element is really where we start getting into the nitty-gritty and the interesting parts of this, where that is where large companies are going to be under a lot of pressure to start reducing their scope 3 down. And there's 2 main reasons for that. One of which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I always have to read because it's not the most snappy title, but the TCFD, they are there to give risk exposure and analysis to what impacts climate change will have on their supply chain. So, for example, Unilever won't be able to make PG tips if all of their tea plantations are either on fire or underwater. And that is going to be exacerbated by climate change, and therefore Unilever have to reduce their risk exposure to that in order to try and continue selling PG tips in the future. The second kind of extension to that, which is coming out in the past couple of months, weeks, is the SDR, so the Sustainability Disclosure Requirements for large businesses. And it goes one step further than the TCFD, where those businesses are going to have to start reporting on how those activities contribute to climate change. And that's quite a small word, but I think it has big impacts in terms of making sure that businesses are not only analysing their exposure and that risk to climate change, but also how their actions are contributing to it and affecting it as a result. Mark Carney, so a lovely picture of him here, ex-Bank of England governor, as well as I think he's now the UN envoy for climate something, very technical term, but he said that climate change is COVID on steroids. So in terms of risk to your supply chain and you actually getting products, I think COVID, the past 2 years, we've seen a lot of disruption. That's not anything really compared to what climate change could do and could bring. And this is why this impact and focus on net zero is so important, because through achieving net zero, you're going to gain a lot of resilience. So the way you do that is that within that scope 3, you are in someone else's supply chain somewhere. Even if you're a very small business as a kind of a freelancer, all the way up to slightly larger organizations, which are going to be more aware of this and have that infrastructure of their supply chain, you're going to be contributing to someone else's emissions. And therefore, somewhere along the chain, you are going to be contributing to someone who really cares about their emissions. So that Unilever may be using a freelancer to design some graphics for PG tips. That freelancer is therefore going to have a contribution to Unilever's emissions, and there's going to be a loop there and a supply chain connection that you need to be aware of. And with TCFD and SDR, we're going to start getting a lot more questions asked of you for that. Companies typically aren't going to want to risk increasing their carbon footprint by working with those who aren't taking action. And therefore, if you are taking action, there is an opportunity there to align with the values of these companies who are reducing their emissions and therefore win business as a result. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we will start to see more and more companies potentially losing business because they don't have climate commitments, and therefore they are posing an extra risk to the supply chain of larger companies. A good example of this is Tesco. So very recently, as in 3 days ago, this came out that Tesco is calling on all of their suppliers to share greenhouse gas data and target net zero and really have a plan for this. So there are 4 key actions Tesco is asking of its supply chain, which is 1, to provide emissions data, 2, set net zero ambitions by the end of 2022. That is not to say, I've written that quite badly, that's not to say net zero by 2022, but more net zero goals and roadmaps by 2022. With an SBTI approved, so the Science Based Targets Initiative roadmap to 2023. Any questions on the different terminology going around here, please do put in the chat and I'll come back to it later. And then 4 is that they start by switching to renewables. So that renewables switch is normally quite easy for companies to do, and therefore they want them to take the first step and the basic thing. The 40 largest suppliers that Tesco posed this to were all very positive about it. And I think this is a real kind of case study of just what's coming and how it's going to play out in real terms, where Tesco's will be under pressure from the TCFD and the SDR to have these commitments, and therefore 95% of Tesco supply chain are going to be farmers and other organisations supplying them food, and therefore they need to be committed to net zero as well. So this is all very well and good, but what can you actually practically do about it, and what does this mean for your business? So I think step one is have very clear net zero commitments, talk about it, make sure you're not shying away from the net zero problem and that you are discussing it. Start looking at your supply chain and going, where's the risk in your supply chain, and where are you potentially, where are your emissions increasing from suppliers who perhaps are not as green as they could be. Write a very transparent sustainability policy, so be honest with it, be transparent with it. Greenwashing is incredibly easy to avoid by just saying what you are and aren't doing. And these are some trigger words for me that I get very angry and will shout at you about, is if you say that you've got a pledge or a commitment or a framework, or that you're being greener, I think you should be very critical of what you're doing, and instead you should be focusing on what action you're actually taking. So if you've got a commitment, how does that translate into actual action? So that's the kind of a brief overview of Scope 3 and all those things around what's coming from a threat point of view, but what are the growth opportunities here, and where can you really start to increase your revenue and grow your business as a result of net zero? So very, very kind of quickly on this, companies, as I mentioned, do want to protect themselves from climate risk, and therefore having clear actions and goals is going to align your values with them. And if you're in a meeting with 3 companies, one of whom has got net zero commitments and 2 of which don't, that company is naturally going to pick this up the person who's got a net zero commitment, because it's making their life easier, and you're going to win business as a result. Secondly, I think that I can't emphasize enough how this is the biggest infrastructure shift that we're going to be seeing in decades, and Scotland's very well placed for this, in the, just to name a few of them: wind, battery storage, electric vehicles, upgrading buildings, retrofitting buildings, public transport. All of these things are infrastructure changes which need to happen, and that's going to mean public spending, and that's going to translate into jobs. So I think really what you need to start doing is looking ahead 5 years and going, how can I get ready and prepare for the changes that are coming, and what policy is going to look like then? And certainly from both Scottish and national governments, it would be nice to have clearer policies, because I think we can always have more ambitious and clearer policies, but we're starting to see trends happen, and it's about positioning yourself ready for that. And very quickly as well, there's also some new business models that are coming through, and the Chamber are doing great work, and I'm not paid to say that, unfortunately, around the circular economy and this idea of waste as a resource. So Circular Glasgow, there's a lot of good examples of companies doing that really well within that network. Some examples being cardboard. Recently this year, we saw a lot of supply chain issues where cardboard wasn't entering into the system, and therefore people were having to recycle it, and it became far more valuable. Electric vehicle batteries, again, there's second life, third life circular applications for them. There's a company called Eco something that do coffee grounds that are based in Glasgow, and they will travel to a coffee shop and buy up the coffee grounds and then reuse them into different applications. Eco Chain, I think it is called. And then there's like refurbishing furniture companies that will take old furniture, refurbish it and resell it. So this kind of model of repairing, remanufacturing, renting, leasing, restoring are all going to create new jobs. So there's predicted 450,000 over 15 years from the Green Alliance. And then also that's before we even get into the whole land management and environmental services aspect of it, which again, Scotland's very well placed for in terms of rewilding the Highlands. And there's a lot of activity going on around that, which has potential for 20,000 new jobs as well. So these are sectors that didn't exist really 5, 10, 15 years ago to the same scale or application that they will do in the future. Yeah, good. I have to put the slide in it. Revive Eco. So a real good example of this is a company that they buy waste coffee grounds from cafes. So the cafe is getting a new revenue stream there from a product they're currently throwing away. That waste becomes a resource. That resource is then turned into another product by them, which is then used in the cosmetics industry and sold into companies. And that circular chain is then that kind of loop is closed. So at each stage, the Revive Eco are growing because they're selling products to companies who are wanting to reduce their footprint down, and therefore it's connecting that dot. And then the cafes are also increasing their revenue because someone's now buying the waste coffee grounds that they were just throwing away before, and because they're now generating waste that is now a resource. So Another thing that doesn't get talked about enough with net zero is that it's all about growing your profits, because net zero is all about reducing waste. So that waste normally means more consumption and more carbon emissions. And that consumption is also going to be spend. So if you're spending £40,000 a month heating a really cold, drafty warehouse, and then you insulate that warehouse and your costs dropped to £20,000 a month, suddenly there's a bit of spend there that you can start saving and means more profit for you. So less waste is less emissions, and therefore it means typically more money for you. And I think this is where the mindset shift really needs to come in. And this is the challenging bit, because it's all the little things as well. If you're delivering parcels to people, do you really need to include that delivery slip? So you might be spending £200 a month on A4 pieces of paper that go out to customers who then pick up that piece of paper and immediately put it in the bin. So there's no point you including it in the first place, because from a user experience point of view, it's not really needed. Do you need to drive to that meeting? Petrol prices are higher than they've ever been in the past decade. So that's going to drive some questions over, do you actually need to spend that money driving to the meeting? That's going to lower your emissions, but also it's going to save you money. And that was a good example that really annoyed me. I was at a net zero workshop event last week, where there was just a TV on in the background in every kind of office room with BBC News on 24/7. And it's like, why is that there? No one's watching it. No one's paying attention to it. You're just using energy for no reason. And again, that energy costs money. Therefore, stop doing it and save yourself some cash. Just zooming in on Scotland very quickly. We're near the end. I'm conscious of the time, but Scotland is very well placed for jobs. So there's a green growth index that was done by Lloyds and Oxford. So by no means kind of eco people historically. These are very big organizations who are very critical of this transition. The net zero transition is expected to create 2.5 million new jobs between now and 2050, with around 1.4 trillion a year invested. And that's both like public sector, private sector, just general activity, with 21,000 green jobs already placed in the in Scotland, which is the highest in the UK and also has the most potential for growth over the next 20 years in the UK. So major growth there coming from the construction and building sector, heating and cooling, wind and nuclear, smart systems and smart grids, and green hydrogen as well. All of those are entire talks on themselves, so I'll just skip over them, but there's a lot that's going on here that could really drive a lot of growth. And in terms of just summary tips for you to take away from this and what you actually do to apply this in your business, I think I'd say start changing your mindset. Net zero isn't about being greener. It's not about saving the planet. It's about being a more profitable business, building more resilience into your business in terms of supply chains, because as we've seen with COVID, it's quite easy for that to be disrupted. And even with like the chip shortages in kind of due to COVID affecting workforces, we're now seeing a lot of repatriation of those supply chains because people are concerned about not being able to control the supply of chips, which then produces cars. So this whole net zero thing does have a real tie into business resilience as well. It means healthy communities, more enjoyable lives, less pollution, more efficient because you're making savings in terms of the amount of stuff you're wasting and reducing that down, and just more productive, more efficient, more profitable. So the list goes on. So I think in terms of business growth, start looking at where you can solve problems, either reducing waste in your business or reusing it. And this goes for both yours and in others. So this comes back to the circular economy thing of, is there actually a waste stream that's being generated by another business, which you can take and turn into a resource, which you then sell? And then also start looking at where the skills shortages are and start trying to fill those demands. So retrofitting is a big one. Heat pumps being a good example of where that may be changing in the next 5 to 10 years. Circular economy, and just general infrastructure upgrades as well. So like electric vehicle charge point installations are being one that isn't happening quick enough, and it's partly due to skills. Write an environmental page on your website, so be very clear about what you're doing. And the format I like to recommend you do it is done, doing, and can't do. So if you are concerned about greenwashing, this format really puts you in a place where the transparency means you won't be accused of it, because you're saying everything you are doing and not doing. So an example might be that you've stopped putting delivery slips into packages and you've set a net zero target. You're currently working on measuring your emissions to get a better idea of where you are in terms of net zero, and you're working on upgrading to electric vehicles, but you might not be able to actually change energy supply because you're renting premises and you can't change your packaging because net zero or low carbon packaging doesn't exist yet. Perfectly fine to have that as the reason. I care more the fact that you've actually looked into it and you've admitted that than you might not have done it at all. Final slide. So this, in summary, this is the biggest economic shift that's happening in decades. It's going to be a real shift in how we do business, and therefore there's going to be a huge opportunity for growth there. This is a new way of doing things, and it's going to be a bumpy ride, but there's one where opportunities will kind of present themselves around circular economy and various other actions that we've discussed. It has to happen. And I think that's something that we're not really talking about or addressing enough, is this isn't an option here. We either achieve net zero through policy and action, or through kind of correction, where, you know, if you start flooding factories and they can't produce any emissions, but they also can't produce any goods because of the impacts of climate change. So this has to happen. Governments are on board with it. They're setting targets for 2050. So we need to start working towards it. And it's either get on board with it now or play catch up in 5 to 10 years. There's a lot of problems that are out there around net zero, and therefore, if you solve them, you're going to earn money. The net zero commitments within your industry is going to become a point of difference, and therefore, if you've got more ambitious net zero targets and are demonstrating action on it, you're going to become a far more attractive business to work with as a result of that, to those larger corporations who are under pressure from SDR and TCFD. And there's also going to be several big areas of investment around energy efficiency, generation, and just business model adoption and change there. So circular economy consultants, for example, will be quite a big growth in the next few years. And that is me. I will now stop ranting at you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for that as well. That's grand. That's grand. And I love, do you know, it sounds ridiculous, but I hadn't actually thought about how being a problem solver could actually be generating you cash as we go through this sort of shift in mindset in the next week as well. So no, thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll be back with some questions for you very shortly. So no, thank you, Adam. And now I'm going to, helps if I don't mute myself while I'm talking. And now I'm going to pass over to Joe from Scottish Government. So Joe, I think I'm sharing the screen for you. So I'll just bring it up here and get this ready to go. And delighted to have you with us, Joe. So Joe Mitchell from Scottish Government, everyone. Oh, I think Joe might be on mute. Sorry, Joe.
No, I think I'm okay, thanks. Just wait for my screen to come up. Thanks, Alan. Is that working?
Yeah, we're just coming. There we go.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Afternoon. I'm Joe Mitchell. I lead on sustainable procurement policy in Scottish Government, and I think there'll be quite a lot of overlap, so I'll be able to skip through quite a lot of this between my presentation and Adam's. So Scottish Government lead procurement policy in Scotland, so we get to set the policy and the legislation, and for the last couple of years we've been focusing quite heavily on climate and procurement. There's quite a high expectation of what procurement can do to achieve net zero. In terms of the wider context, if you put the next slide on, please, Alan. Sorry, no, please. These are the pieces of legislation. So we've had legislation since 2009. The emission targets changed in 2019, so slightly different to what Adam was quoting, with net zero by 2045, with interim targets of 75% by 2030 and 90% by 2040. The Climate Change Committee decided that Scotland would be able to achieve that, so that's where the change came from. We've had reporting duties on public bodies since 2015, including one on how procurement policy and activity contributes to combat with climate change. And they were updated in 2020 to have sort of get people to align their spending more widely, public bodies to align their spending more widely with emissions, which is quite helpful for us because it makes it more strategic. It means that people are thinking at the outset when they're spending money, how that's going to affect the emissions and how the emissions are going to be created. A little bit of procurement context on the next slide. Thanks, Alan. So we've got something called Procurement Reform Scotland Act, which many of you may be familiar with. It's been around since 2014. Most of it was enacted in 2016. At the centre of that, Sustainable Procurement Duty, which then gives us this sort of policy legislation line of sight to climate. We don't have duplication of legislation, but the idea is that in the process of complying with the Sustainable Procurement Duty, that public bodies will also work to address climate and environmental considerations. So 3 strands: improving economic, social and environmental well-being, involving small and medium enterprises, so facilitating access to public contracts, and thirdly, promoting innovation. So I think this topic covers all three. So people have to consider how they can do that and then act in a way to achieve it. Next slide. This is probably a useful one. Obviously, Adam describes scope 1, 2, and 3. I quite like this because I really find it hard, or have found it hard, probably getting better at remembering what's what. So this is a sample carbon management boundary, which anybody can do this for their own business, but it sort of describes scope 1, 2, and 3. So if you're trying to, for your own purpose, try and work out what's what, that these types of building diagrams are helpful. I think this one is actually for Scottish Government, so because I think we do have about 170 buildings, and that's how scope 1, 2, and 3 emission boundaries work for us. I thought I'll give you a little bit more. Yeah, I know. Next slide, please. So just to a quick outbreak about a little bit more about the sort of planning and policy in Scottish Government. This doesn't really sit in procurement, but obviously we're very interested in what our colleagues are thinking, and actually thought it might be helpful. So in the next slide, there's a little bit of a breakdown. I think these slides will be available after the presentation, so don't feel that I'm rushing through and you're missing everything. But it's just to say that we have identified, I think it's 8 categories, including agriculture, industry, transport, electricity, waste, buildings, negative emissions, which is carbon capture and storage, and trees at the moment. Just sort of the things that Scottish Government are going to focus on. And also helpfully in the next slide, so these are in our carbon management plan update. We have the sort of route map plan from 18 to 32, and the key announcements that have been made in terms of the funding that's going to be available. So I thought you guys might be interested in seeing that today. Not planning to focus on it, planning more to move on to procurement. Another set of key themes on the next slide, which are fit very well, because I mean, even though traditionally a lot of policies have been siloed, this actually shows a real cut across. So investing to drive demand, as the previous slide demonstrated, interest in skills and training for green jobs, building resilience. And again, as Adam said, this is not a Woolies topic. This is a real sort of thing that's going to affect everybody's business if we don't change. Positive behaviour change, which is the wider population, and a place-based approach, which is actually taking on board what needs to be happening in different places. So in the next slide, what we were asked, so in about, I think it was 2019, basically First Minister and Programme for Government said, what are you going to do? So the 3 main sources that we're asking, the reducing emissions and the targets that have changed, as I showed earlier in the slide pack, and the fact that we now have to sort of be more transparent in terms of our plans of achieving the emission reduction targets, and how, obviously, as people in the Scottish Government, we can contribute to the adaptation programme, which involves a lot of investment in infrastructure. So I suppose the main bit of the presentation for me is what we're going to do. So the next slide, please, Alan. So as I said, there was a programme for government commitment to leverage 12.6 public procurement spend to contribute towards the transition to net zero. And in response to that, we set up the Climate and Procurement Forum. And in the next slide, there's a sort of breakdown of what that forum does. So there's a strategy and objectives work stream. So the main forum consists of public procurement people from across Scotland. So we've got central government, local government, health, higher and further education. I don't think I've missed anybody, so I hope I haven't. And the underpinning work streams, we've got more of a mixture of people. We've got people with climate interest, business interest, etc. So the strategy and objectives work streams kind of sets some of the tone for this. I was responsible for putting out what's called the Scottish Public Procurement Policy Note, some sort of leadership statements, did some prioritisation about what we should address first across the sectors. People and capability I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, because that's quite important. Operational procurement is very much supposed to be aimed at actual projects that people are procuring, but actually one of the things they came up with was a sort of net zero template, which public bodies are expected to try and use to help them, again, set out how they're prioritising their path to net zero, and then track the progress. Supplier and market engagement, very close to my heart, very close to our sustainable procurement duty, and I'll give you a little bit more detail about that in a moment. And lastly, monitoring reporting, which is a complete nightmare because it's so complex for this area. But again, the point for us is to sort of break down this into manageable pieces of work so we can actually do something tangible and meaningful. So on the next slide, a little bit of information on the climate and procurement. Obviously, this is a procurement-focused work stream, but we have, on the back of that, we have sustainable procurement tools which actually help public bodies to comply with the sustainable procurement duty. And we've banded that together to include all the climate content. And one of the most important products that we've produced, we launched this in March of this year, is a product called Climate Literacy for Procurers. The reason I'm mentioning that today is because it is free to use. You do have to register on the tools, but you won't be getting mail bombed or anything. It's just a case of, if you're interested in looking at this, it takes about an hour and a half, but the first 45 minutes really describe a lot of what Adam was saying, frankly, so climate literacy, and the next 45 minutes are quite procurement specific. But again, if people are interested in using it, please help yourselves, please feel free. And we tested a lot with people who were going to have to do it when we were developing it, so it is quite user-friendly and has been very well received. We're also looking at a range of mentoring and case study development, so actually people have real-life examples. Looking at stuff on the Crosstail Link Road, we've got little examples from Glasgow Kirkland College that we're developing, so there's quite a lot which we hope will help people understand how to make this real and how to do it in practice. So I'm going to go to the next slide, please. Supplier and market engagement. So as the slide says, we want to try and get consistency of message. We want to try and get the public sector to ask similar questions. We want the public sector in the procurement to actually describe what good looks like. And we want to work with suppliers that want to bid for public contracts to try and have a palatable route to net zero. So we realise that a lot of small suppliers, this was quite new to them. We realise that given how things have been for the last year and a half, that climate might be quite a difficult thing to take on board. So we've got a range of work going on. And one of them is actually, rather than sort of being very bullish about this, to try and do two things. One is to actually look at things like the single procurement document and provide more guidance of what people should ask or what people should be looking for. And similarly, to make sure that suppliers are cited in that, primarily through the Supplier Development Programme. So I think Pauline and I will be speaking a lot more about that in the future. And then sort of at the higher end, the sort of prioritising supplier engagement and trying to make sure that everybody isn't asking suppliers the same things. So trying to manage that a bit. But really important work stream. We are commissioning some work to look at service delivery to actually try and get people on board in terms of, again, taking recognition of how difficult things have been for small business in Scotland and small delivery services. I mean, social care is the second biggest spend area in the public sector in Scotland. How are they supposed to engage on net zero, and how can we help them get on board and still be able to access public sector tenders? So that's a really important piece of work. Next slide, please, Alan. Yeah, as I said, monitoring and reporting, very, very complicated. Interestingly, I noticed that Adam said 90%. We reckon in public sector it's about 60% is scope 3. We'll remember from the diagram earlier that people in my colleagues in Scottish Government have been reporting on 1 and 2 for some time because public sector mandates to do that. This slide explains why it's complicated and why there won't be a quick fix. We recognise there are limitations to equating spend and emissions, and we, in some cases we might do that as a very sort of first step, very rough and ready calculation, but there are huge risks attached to doing that. There isn't a single measure. I mean, there can't be a single measure. The variety of goods, services and works that we procure are far too vast. So what we really want to encourage people to do, and that very much resonates with the message Adam was giving, is say what you can do, focus your energy on affecting change through reduced initiatives. So do real things and tell us and try and help. We want to try and help people to actually, to appreciate people when they're doing that and businesses when they're doing that. So it's very, very complicated. And there's another slide on monitoring and reporting. Thanks. So for us, what we've started by doing was looking at some of the hotspots, so looking across some of the projects that public sector are buying and trying to see where we can do better. As I said, development of the practical approach, so we're not making it more difficult for bidders, and trying to agree monitoring project, because under the Procurement Reform Act, Sustainable Procurement Duty, public bodies have to sort of set out in the procurement strategies what they're going to do, and then annual reports say what they've done. And they also have the public sector reporting duties, which are saying one response we'll do in terms of climate and procurement, we'll do for both reports, but actually let's try and get some real useful information and consistency of reporting. So that's really all I wanted to say. I think the plan is that Pauline goes next, and then we have some time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo, as well. I'm just remembering, it's funnily enough, it's been a couple of weeks actually since I've last used Zoom, which I never thought I'd be saying a couple of weeks ago, because we've actually been out doing some face-to-face activity. But thank you so much for taking us through that there, Jo. It is a bit of a minefield for so many businesses. So I think even just getting some of the pointers that you were saying, you know, it's okay to sort of accept that you're not quite there yet, but sort of plotting out your journey and your route map on the years going forward, and sharing that story with Scottish Government during the process as well, I think is a fantastic tip as well. So thank you for that. We'll come back to some questions. I'm sure that there will be some questions from people in the room. But now we're going to pass over to Pauline. And Pauline, I've known you for years, and so I thought it'd be really useful to have you along here to share a wee bit about the Supply Development Programme, or the SDP as some of us know it as, and what you guys are doing in Glasgow, and where people can get further information in relation to opportunities around that.
Okay, thank you, Alan, and thank you to the Chamber for inviting me along today, and also for Adam and Jo. Great talks from both of you, and certainly I can see the linkage and where the profits come from, and from a Scottish Government perspective, I guess hopefully for businesses, where you see how something that seems so far away, like Scottish Government policy, how very quickly that will trickle down the supply chain and affect you as a small business just trying to win work. So yeah, excellent to join all those dots. So as Alan said, my name is Pauline Wallace. I work in economic development within Glasgow City Council, and one of the projects that I manage is the Supplier Development Programme for Glasgow. Although it is a national programme, so wherever your business is based in Scotland, you can access the support that's available. Just want to take a few minutes to let you know what you can access, the events that are there, and that all the support is free to SMEs and third sector organisations within Scotland. The programme's a business development initiative, so first and foremost, it's there to support you as a business and to help you grow. We deliver support in all aspects of tendering. So looking primarily at how do you as a business tender for public sector contracts, but we do look at subcontract opportunities as well. So the events and training cover everything from, I've never tendered before, I don't even know if it's right for me, which it may not be, what the acronyms mean, where you find the opportunities, where are the websites that you can see what public sector are offering, how you, I guess, assess whether it's the right opportunity for you as well, then how you go on to bid for and hopefully win contracts. If you do win contracts, how do you manage that contract and try and increase your opportunities for further afield, for different products and services, and increase, I guess, increase your chances of winning, if you like. As we've spoken about, quite quickly, large public sector contracts will trickle down through a supply chain. So you may not be the tier one contractor, but you may have subcontract opportunities available to you. So one of the things that the programme also does, I run a number of Meet the Buyer events. Now, these can be directly with public sector, so it's putting a face to that organisation that you're trying to bid for, but also with these subcontractors who are now the company who are building the bridge or supplying the food to schools. And that way you can see where your business might best well fit within that supply chain. There will be an awful lot more. It used to be that within procurement, everyone wanted to know about quality assurance and health and safety, and those things are all still really, really important. But net zero is finding its way into those tenders, into those contracts, and into contractors who are trying to win work. And if you're not helping them to compete and meet their net zero targets, then you're a less attractive business for them to work with. That is just the way of it. So we are trying to do as much as we can as a support initiative to help you get there. The main thing really for accessing the programme, somebody does a thumbs up that's there, really is the website. That's it. If you're already registered with the programme, basically go onto the calendar. There are events running throughout the year. Most of them are online at the moment, so distance isn't an issue. Probably helping the programme itself get towards its net zero is that it's not making you drive everywhere to attend an event. So many of the events are on webinars. They probably will go back to some face-to-face, but for now, the actual amount of training and support that is available is the same as it's always been. It's just in a different format. So please go on the calendar, see what's available to you and book. If you're not already registered, it's really easy. Go on the website, a few business details. You then have access to go in and book your own events. And that's it. You can do that for whichever ones you see that are going to support you. To say the details are all there on screen. My email address is there. If there's anything specifically about the programme and the events, there's a contact page for the Supplier Development Programme as well. Yeah, I would just urge you to go on, take a look at it, and basically take as much advantage of the support that's available just now, because this is something that is going to become more and more prevalent. As it's already important, but you will see it pushing into contracts, and how you show that you deliver that is going to become more and more, I guess, prevalent for you. And it could be those final few points that win the contract over not winning the contract. So yes, so please go on the website, have a look. Any questions, then please just get in touch with us. And I'll pass you back to Alan. And if there is any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Grand. Thank you very much, Pauline. And yes, please do visit the website. And what we will say is we'll share the slides afterwards, and we will share the web address that Pauline just pointed to as well, so that you can register with the Supply Development Programme too, and get access to the world that Pauline was just telling you about there too. So thank you very much to you all. I'm going to throw it over and see if we've got any questions or any comments that people want to make. And I know that I'm hoping a few of you will take that opportunity as well. I think I wanted to obviously ask a couple of you, because these are coming from very different perspectives. Adam, from the commercial background of being a business owner, sort of what you're hearing on the ground from some of the businesses that you're engaging with, because I know that you've been working very closely with around that net zero agenda and trying to encourage businesses to look at that. What's the sort of feedback you're getting from those sort of businesses, if they look towards procurement, or if they're looking towards how they put a net zero strategy into the sort of framework of their business that maybe puts them in a better position to approach sort of the procurement. And then a sort of question for Jo as well, just around sort of like what sort of feedback you're getting from businesses as well, if you're getting any sort of thing as they approach this net zero. Are people coming to you proactively looking to sort of develop their strategies as well? I just think it'd be really interesting to see how you are both engaging with sort of business communities at this time. And Pauline, if you want to chip in, you are very welcome as well. Thank you. Adam, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the two kind of keywords that come to mind are probably fear and confusion. There's a lot of fear around greenwashing, and how, if you do have a net zero commitment or roadmap, is it going to attract kind of negative criticism from people? Perhaps not so much on the procurement side, but just generally, and therefore people do tend to keep even companies that are doing a lot of good work, keeping those cards quite tight to their chest, which is a bit of a frustration really, when that could be winning them more work, and it could actually be something they stand behind and are proud of in these meetings rather than hiding it away. And then I think really confusion around where to get started. So there's a lot of information out there, and this is kind of the entire reason Small 99 exists, is to try and take that information and feed it into a more manageable, digestible kind of feed, as it were, rather than it just being all out there and people not really knowing where to start with net zero and going, how do we, okay, so we know we need to get a commitment together. We can't afford a consultant to do it for us. So where do we get started? And I don't think there's a real easy answer to that in the minute, and I think that will come. And I think that the slides that Joe had around kind of spend-based measurement of your carbon emissions is a good place to start, but it needs to be a starting point, not an end point. And just, I think it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but a lot of it is that the data is going to come down the line. We are at the start of this journey. It's going to develop over the next 5-10 years, and the tools are only going to improve and the data is going to improve, but it needs that groundswell of people starting to measure something before we actually, that feeds into kind of more people in that chain having information.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Adam. And Joe, just maybe from the other perspective, are you finding businesses are sort of proactively coming to you now, looking to sort of see how they get net zero into the sort of business strategies and plans to maybe make them more open to sort of procurement opportunities as the government legislation changes? Or I know that you mentioned that there is support there and that the government are willing to work with companies as well. Just if there was any sort of feedback you were getting from the business side, community engagement.
So that wouldn't really be me, but actually I did have a really useful conversation with my colleagues who work in manufacturing, and so in response to the requests of small Scottish manufacturers, who obviously, as you know, most manufacturers are small, 92% I think, and 4% medium, about 9,500 manufacturers in Scotland. They really are, they're sort of saying we need to do something about net zero, how they do this. So they're sponsoring a CivTech challenge to try and find a route to do this. And the nice thing is that, because we speak to them, including this morning, we're going to try and mesh that with the work we're doing in the Supplier Market Workstream. So in the Supplier Market Workstream, so we have actually got Gillian from the Supplier Development Programme on that workstream. We've also invited one of their businesses. We have larger business, so business services associations. So we asked them to send somebody. They very helpfully sent somebody from Robertson's Facilities Management, and sent also from third sector. We've got CEIS, who support the Just Enterprise, which is a social enterprise kind of business support contract the Scottish Government runs. So they'd actually gone out to their customers, and at the start of this year, actually, Supplier Development Programme weren't getting a lot of response in terms of the whole net zero thing, but I think it's transforming. I think COP's given it a real boost. There's just nowhere else to look. The third sector were quite relaxed, and they felt people were quite on board. So I think we are getting, not me specifically, but that probably wouldn't be the most helpful person to speak to. But the thing is that we are getting a lot, and people are reacting. So the other place is to find business support. So the first place that I looked, because I thought, what sort is there out there for business apart from the Supplier Development Programme? When I first looked at it about a year ago, there was practically nothing on climate, and now there's a lot more. So we know people are really interested. We know that we need to get Scottish businesses on board, and I suppose from my point, from a procurement point of view, is to try and stop people asking questions that's going to eliminate them, or ask questions that are not, procurement words, relevant, proportionate. Ask for standards when it's not standards we want. It's actions.
Thank you very much, Joe. Like that, it's actions rather than standards. So
Please.
That's fantastic. So I'm noticing no one's asked a question, so I'm going to pick on someone in the audience, and he's sitting very unsuspectedly because I can see who I'm about to ask. He doesn't know, obviously, who I am. I'm going to ask Paul, who I know works quite a lot with sort of procurement firms. Sorry, Paul, I'm putting you on the spot here as well, a wee bit as well, but just sort of, if you're getting any sort of feedback from small firms on their sort of procurement journey around the sort of net zero and sustainability objectives that Joe's maybe outlined from Scottish Government a minute ago.
Yeah, it's something. I was actually in the middle of typing a message.
Sorry, I could see you typing something. I thought he better be typing a question there. I just thought I'd just jump straight.
No, you're all right. So yeah, I've spent over sort of 12 years in public procurement, but I I now help businesses with their procurement and their bidding for government contracts. And I think what I see is I work with a wide range of businesses from SMEs up to large construction companies. And I think obviously the bigger companies are more mature with what they've with their policies and what they're going to do in this market. And I was at a conference in Edinburgh last week, and basically all they talked about was net zero and what they're doing to start to work towards this. But I think at the kind of smaller end of the scale, there's probably less known about this, and the fact that I think down south, is it now going to be a requirement that companies have carbon reduction plans in place and evidence of what they're moving towards? I'm not sure, is that happening in Scotland as well?
So UK policy notes issued earlier this year, which took effect from September, and that's for really huge contracts, which where the spend is over 5 million a year.
Yeah.
So obviously we're recognising that, but to avoid the risk that people who are very procurement people who are very busy letting contracts just take the shortcut and go straight for have a carbon management plan for contracts that are a lot lower value, we're trying to say create some guidance which actually says, start off with something like, do you know what scope 1 and 2 are? and then build up from there and have a sort of both a risk and value based matrix. So we're doing that through the supplier market engagement workstream.
Yeah.
But I don't quote me on this, but I think you'd have to push me for me to say, to put out a policy like that, but even though it's nuanced, it's quite often not how people read things. Even though the policy says where it's relevant proportionate, where it's over spending over 5 million a year in the contract, that's where you ask for this. My experience is that people don't always treat those policies in the way they're intended. So I'd like us to be a bit more nuanced.
But I suppose, well, it's maybe not policy at the moment, it's coming, isn't it? It's just maybe not immediately, but companies are going to, or probably let's say the more proactive companies who do things now are going to get themselves into a better position, because it's going to just filter down eventually, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm promoting the climate literacy. As I say, it started out as something that was for buyers. When CIS came to supplier market engagement, they'd actually done the climate literacy, and they said, I don't know why everybody just doesn't do this. So as I say, it's a free product. We can't, we have to leave it in one place, but we're more than happy for any business that wants to complete it. And people, public, private, third sector, Scotland, all across the globe, people have used it. We're quite happy with that. That was the point. The point wasn't for us to measure, although we have had to find out how many people have done it. That wasn't the point for us. The point was something that makes it easier for people to understand this language that they're going to be then asked questions about. Getting you ready.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, Paul, as well. And I see, thank you, Mark, for this. I see you've got a question as well. So, Mark, let me just see. I think you should be able to unmute yourself, Mark. I think you're there already.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. I'm a bit of an interloper. I'm actually a member of the London Chamber, the London Chamber's Net Zero initiative, and Harry Bowles from Bay said you should this. So, and it was excellent. So, really good to hear. And obviously we've just started an initiative at the London Chamber, and the idea really is, we've got some larger companies, I guess like the Glasgow Chamber, and to try and take their experiences, but also help the SMEs and through it. So I guess it'd be interesting just to understand, I guess what's going on elsewhere, and where would you direct? We're going through the thing about how do you get across the jargon? What are the best case studies which could be appropriate for maybe some of the smaller companies to learn from, and where should we direct them for more advice? And some of these, even the London Chamber members, some of the smaller companies also deal across the country. So I think it's certainly relevant. And I guess the other question also was, I guess you're from the Scottish Government, but how is it working in the councils, and how's the stuff you're doing, Joe, permeating through the councils, and how can you help them also with their sustainable procurement approach?
So it's quite useful to have you here, Mark, because one of the things for us is the whole of Scotland's probably about the same size as London. So we do have, and I know that procurement like Transport for London and GLA do speak to each other, and similarly public sector across Scotland speak to each other. We work closely with local authorities. We have a kind of governance structure which is headed up by our director, but that involves local authorities, health, further and higher education, and the wider central government bodies. So anything we do, we're trying to communicate with them. It's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy. I think communication is a huge part of our job, and it's difficult to actually getting the reach. So you think you're telling people this stuff. We did a huge launch, for example, for climate literacy, but we still have people going, I've not heard of that yet. And you're thinking, how not? But we have, because we have policy and legislation, the policy note in January was quite useful. We have a policy forum, which again has this cross-sectoral reach. So we've got a number of fora that have this cross-sectoral reach. And there's degrees of separation. I'd say there's about 2 degrees of separation in procurement in Scotland. It's really, so I'm not saying it's perfect, but we've got a long tradition of speaking to each other and testing things.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much, and thank you, Mark, for the question as well, and for joining us from London today as well. So thank you very much. I am just conscious of time because it's amazing how fast an hour can go. Really, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to just put one final question, and if anyone does have any questions that weren't answered today, please get in touch with either Michael or myself. I see that Frank's just asked a question. So Frank, I'll let you have a question. So on you go, Frank. I'm just reading it here. So Frank is saying, Adam touched on greenwashing, and everyone has talked about having environmental policies and commitments, particularly on their websites now. But how is this, or how should it be audited, I think is what the future by public bodies. So I think what Frank's really asking is, like, I think a lot of people can talk the talk, but how are we going to make sure that they are walking the walk, sort of thing, as well, in terms of like the sort of commitments and the agendas that they've got there as well. So I just want to say, in other words, to ensure that green net zero focus is embedded for the future in a lot of the contracts that are being awarded. So Joe, I think this is another one for you. So I think it's just how you talked about the monitoring and the complexity of it when you were going through your presentation, but just how are you going to hold companies to account and continue to review that throughout the duration of a contract? Yeah, I mean, contract management is a universal issue, so it's just another thing that we have to build into that. But part of the point of the monitoring and reporting work is actually sort of, and the Green Cross-Chain Link was a really good example, is that the supplier has committed to something like over 50% carbon reduction on what the original baseline asked for 30%, and the supplier's committed. So actually that's a really important part of that contract, and that will be measured, and so again, that's why this has to be prioritized, to go after the sort of higher impact goods, services and works at the inset. There's huge investment in construction. I have to admit, my focus because of that is to think about, as a couple of the other long tail, starting with about 18% spend on social care. But again, it's to make it manageable and to make sure you're not asking silly questions. Am I allowed to say this, working in policy? Policy is not my major interest when I'm looking at a tender, if I'm looking at I really am looking at people telling me what they're going to do. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go because I actually have another meeting, but I'm really glad I came, and it's been lovely to meet everybody. So thank you for the invite. Thank you very much. Apologies, we are overrunning a little bit there as well, but we will, as I said, we'll share the presentations, we'll share the slides, and if you do have any questions, reach out to Michael and myself. But can I just say a huge thank you to Adam, for coming up with the concept and for getting in touch with us, to Joe for joining us today and squeezing us into a busy day as well. So thank you very much for that. And to Pauline as well. Pauline, it's always great to work with you, and thank you so much. So I thank you all for joining us, and I do hope to see you again at a Chamber webinar soon. Thank you very much. All right, thanks very much. Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.